In our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast today, we're looking at Psalm 42. This is one of the best known and most beloved of the Psalms, primarily because of the first two verses, which I believe, unfortunately, are often misunderstood. These are wonderful verses just on the surface, and we have written songs about them, and we have sought to follow these in our own drawing near to God, because they're so beautiful, so poetic. They say, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? So this seems at first to be just the great desire on the part of this psalmist to draw near to God, to know God better, to hunger and thirst for God himself. And that certainly is a wonderful model for us. You and I, many of our issues of life go back to the idea that we simply do not hunger and thirst for the living God as we should. And so these verses seem to speak to that, and taken just to the two verses alone, they do. But when we look at the context, we move on down through the psalm, we find that there's a bigger picture here that we shouldn't miss. For example, in verse 3, he says this, "My tears have been my food day and night, when they say to me all day long, where is your God?" So he is in turmoil again, poor David. He just seems like he's battling this, that, and the other all the time. He's hungering for God. He's thirsty for God. But the reason why is because he's in turmoil. His tears are with him day and night. And there are people that are challenging him, saying, why doesn't your God rescue you? I mean, you're trusting God, and you claim to be the follower of God, and so forth. But where is your God when you need him? And so the psalmist here, and we're not sure who this psalmist is. It says the sons of Korah at the superscription, but we don't know for sure who wrote this. But this is a person who is hungering for God, thirsting for God, but because they're in turmoil, they're going through difficult times. They really are desperate for the Lord. And I suppose in many ways that's when we are most desperate for the Lord, when we're going through these times. So what's going to help us? What's going to help our psalmist here? Well, first, before we actually look at that, I want you to note how down he is, because he repeatedly uses the word despair. In verse 5, he says, "Why are you in despair, O my soul? And why have you become disturbed within me?" Verse 6, "O my God, my soul is in despair within me." Over in verse 11, "Why are you in despair, O my soul?" And then in Psalm 43, verse 5, which apparently is a companion psalm, it says this, "Why are you in despair, O my soul, and why are you disturbed within me?" So we see this despair. I mean, he's not just struggling, he's in despair. He's throwing his hands up, more or less. Is there any hope for a person in despair, a child of God who's come to this point? Well, I think if we follow the steps that this psalmist did, I think we'll find great hope. Number one, what did he do? Verse 4, he remembered. Verse 4, he says, "These things I remember, and I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go along with the throng and lead them in the procession to the house of God, with the voice of joy and thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival." If you drop down to verse 6, he says, "Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan," and so forth. So the first thing that we see the psalmist doing is remembering the experiences and the truth that he's had and has known in the past. So he might be in despair at this moment. He might really be down and struggling, but he wants to recall those times when the Lord has come alongside to rescue him. And this is important for us, folks. It's really, really important that we recall the times the Lord has come through, because in the heat of the battle, sometimes we can despair. But when we remember what he's done for us in the past, repeatedly, then we will have strength and encouragement to go forward, knowing that the God who rescued us in the past is the same God who will rescue us now. So we begin by remembering here. Secondly, in verse 5, we find hope. He says, "Why are you in despair, O my soul, and why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him for the help of his presence." Look at verse 11. And he says, "Why are you in despair, O my soul, and why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him." So the same idea, but twice. So his hope is firmly planted, as it was in the psalm I think we looked at yesterday. His hope is firmly planted, not in his own actions and not in circumstances, but in God. And so as he plants his hope in God, that will be the thing that will draw him out of this despair. And then thirdly, he recognizes in verse 7 that even in the hard times, the Lord is actually in charge of those times. He says in verse 7, "Deep calls to deep at the sound of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have rolled over me." Notice how often he says your. 3 different times in verse 7 he says these are your things. These are not random things. These are not incidental or accidental things. These are your things, your waterfalls, your breakers, your waves. The trials and struggles that have come into his life are not accidental. They are divinely appointed by the Lord himself. And while we don't like that sometimes, and sometimes it causes us to want to despair, the fact of the matter is the Lord does some of his very best work in our lives during those times when we are desperately struggling. And the Lord brings these things our way, not to hurt us, not to harm us, but to help us and to enable us to grow in the ways that we should grow. And then one more thing we would note in verse 8, he recognizes God will rescue him in his time. The Lord will command his loving kindnesses in the daytime, and his song will be with me in the night, a prayer to God of my life. The Lord will rescue me when he is ready to do so. His loving kindness will show up when it is God's timing to do so. And so he recognizes his despair, but he also recognizes that God has helped him so many times before, and he recalls those kinds of things. And then he places his hope in God, not in himself or the circumstances. And then he realizes that God uses even the hard times to perfect us and to mature us in him. And so he realizes that at the end that God will rescue him from his despair when God is ready to do so. In those times of despair, it's hard for us to trust him sometimes. But that's exactly what the psalmist is doing here. He's learning to trust the Lord in the dark, just like he learned to trust the Lord in the light.